After defeating England, a nation whose government it viewed as tyrannical, Americans were reluctant to grant great powers to its own central government. The Articles of Confederation, the first government of the United States, reflected this reluctance. Under the Articles, there was no executive, that is, no president, and no national court system. A one-house Congress with equal representation existed, but it had no power to tax or enforce the laws it passed. The central government also was unable to require fulfillment of any obligations it entered into with foreign nations. Passage of laws required a supermajority. These and other restrictions made the first government of the United States weak and ineffectual. Severe economic troubles produced radical economic and political movements such as Shays' Rebellion, an armed insurrection by farmers in western Massachusetts against the state government. Debt-ridden farmers, struck by the economic depression that followed the American Revolution, petitioned the state Senate to issue paper money and to halt foreclosure of mortgages on their property and their own imprisonment for debt as a result of high land taxes. Sentiment was particularly high against the commercial interests who controlled the state Senate in Boston. When the state Senate failed to undertake reform, armed insurgents under the leadership of Daniel Shays and others began forcibly to prevent the county courts from sitting to make judgments for debt. In September, they forced the state Supreme Court at Springfield to adjourn. State forces were raised and sent in to repel an attack on a federal arsenal in the state. Over several months, battles between Shays' forces and both state and private forces were waged until the rebels were eventually forced to disperse, some fleeing to other states and territories. The monetary schemes of the states brought floods of paper money, which some of the states, notably Rhode Island, attempted to force creditors to accept. The threat to economic stability alarmed the wealthy conservative class. The merchants, who disliked the state taxes on imports, were also harassed by the impossibility of making stable agreements with English merchants. They were anxious to have a stronger federal government to guarantee order and property rights. The men who had money invested in Western territories also favored a stronger federal government controlling the territories. Therefore, agitation for the adoption of a stronger national government grew in force. After failed attempts to hold national conferences to resolve trade and navigation disagreements between the states, a call was issued to convene a general convention to revise the Articles of Confederation to meet at Philadelphia in May 1787. Notice was sent to Congress, but the new convention was launched as an extra-legal body. Cautious congressional endorsement came only after 5 states had already selected their delegates. The convention at Philadelphia drew up one of the most influential documents of Western world history, the Constitution of the United States. All the states except Rhode Island sent representatives. The delegates mainly came from the wealthier and more conservative ranks of society. The convention immediately set about drawing up a new scheme of government. However, it found itself faced with a rift. The smaller states wanted to retain their power, and the larger states wanted to have power determined by population. It was agreed that the new Congress should be made an effective body, but as to its composition, there was great difference of opinion. The fundamental question was the apportionment of power in the new government. Edmund Randolph offered a plan known variously as the Randolph, the Virginia, or the Large State Plan. It provided for a bicameral legislature, a 2-house legislature, with the lower house elected according to population and the upper house elected by the lower. William Patterson offered the New Jersey or Small State Plan. It provided for equal representation of states in Congress. Neither the large states nor the small states would yield, and for a time it seemed that the convention would fail. Oliver Ellsworth and Roger Sherman put forward a compromise measure that gradually won approval. This provided for a lower house to be elected according to population, the House of Representatives, and an upper house to be chosen by the states, the Senate. The initial compromise diffused the threat of a walkout by the small states, and the convention settled down to complete its task. Slavery was a central consideration in the convention. In the heated debates over representation in the Congress, the question arose as to how and if the slaves should be counted. Most of the Northern delegates could not regard slaves in a light other than property, so they certainly didn't consider them worthy of representation. The Georgia and South Carolina delegates were loud in their demands that blacks be counted equally with the whites. Many Northerners rejected this idea of being placed on equal footing with slaves, while others condemned any proposal that would recognize slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, that was finally written, probably didn't please anyone, but demonstrated the power of the pro-slavery interests. Slaves were to be treated as property in assessing taxes, but every 5 slaves would count as 3 people to determine representation. In another compromise, the slave trade was extended for 20 years to the end of 1808. This is Article 2, Section 9 of the Constitution. There were, naturally, many other points of argument, and some of the delegates were so disgusted that they went home and later led the fight in the states against ratification of the Constitution. The convention was in session until September 17, 1787, and the document was then sent to the states for ratification. Delaware ratified it first on December 7th of that year. There were serious struggles in most of the states, especially since the convention had obviously gone beyond its mandate merely to amend the Articles of Confederation. The Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays on the proposed new Constitution of the United States and on the nature of Republican government, published between 1787 and 1788 by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, was an effort to persuade New York State voters to support ratification. The authors of the Federalist Papers presented a defense of the new federal system and of the major departments in the proposed central government. They also argued that the existing government under the Articles of Confederation was defective, and the proposed Constitution would fix its weaknesses without endangering the liberties of the people. The creation and adoption of the Constitution were open to charges that the convention delegates had overstepped their mandate. They had only been authorized to devise improvements to the Articles of Confederation. Instead, the convention produced an entirely new government, and it was to be approved not by the legislatures of the 13 states, as provided in the Articles, but by the people of each state, in specially elected state ratifying conventions, packed in some instances with supporters of the new government. North Carolina and Rhode Island rejected the Constitution, but the majority clause brought the Constitution into force without them by the end of June 1788, and they were later forced to accept it. The Constitution concisely organizes the country's basic political institutions. The main text comprises 7 articles. Article 1 vests all legislative powers in the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Article 2 vests executive power in the office of the Presidency of the United States. The President, selected by an electoral college to serve a 4-year term, is given responsibilities common to chief executives, including serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, negotiating treaties, and granting pardons. The President's vast appointment powers which include members of the federal judiciary and the cabinet, are subject to the advice and consent majority approval of the Senate. Article 3 places judicial power in the hands of the courts. The Constitution is interpreted by the courts, and the Supreme Court of the United States is the final court of appeal from the state and lower federal courts. Article 4 requires states to recognize the official acts, judicial proceedings, and privileges of citizens of other states. Article 5 stipulates the procedures for amending the Constitution. Amendments may be proposed by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress or by a convention called by Congress on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. Proposed amendments must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or by conventions in as many states, depending on the decision of Congress. Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for office holders, also deals with public debts and the supremacy of the Constitution, citing the document as the supreme law of the land. Article 7 stipulated that the Constitution would become operational after being ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The creation and ratification of the U.S. Constitution reflected the attempts to create a sustainable order after the Revolution. In some ways, it demonstrates a retreat from the expanding political participation seen during the war and the difficulties of governance. How do you ensure individual liberty, manage political disagreement, and create consistent and fair governance? How do you balance these often competing goals and interests? These questions and these debates they foster are embedded in the Constitution and continue to this day.